Hi everyone. Today I'm starting the video lectures for ancient Greece. Before I get started, I want to show you a couple books that I think are worth investing in if you really like studying ancient Greek history. The first one is called A Brief History of Ancient Greece, Politics, Society, and Culture. This is my copy from college. You can get this off of Amazon for $5. It's a complete history of ancient Greece. It's a good secondary source, so if you kind of wanted something to guide you through, this would be a good book to get. The other book is The History by Herodotus. This is a primary history source. Herodotus is kind of considered the father of history, the first historian. So this is going to be reading stories about Greece that are written, thousands of years ago. So it's a good primary source, and it's a lot of fun to read. So I would suggest getting this. Those are the two books I think I would start off with if I were you. Okay, if you want to follow along, just download the Ancient Greece 1 PDF file. That's what we're kind of going to use today. And I'm going to actually speed through it. I'm not going to lecture on every slide. I kind of just want to introduce Greece to you today. So let me click on it here. Okay, so if you look at slide 2, historians have divided the history of Greece down into different ages or eras or periods: the Bronze Age, the Dark Ages, the Archaic period, the Classical period, the Hellenistic period, and eventually Greece kind of gets eclipsed by the Romans as far as history is concerned. There's two eras I do want you to kind of have memorized. It'll be a quiz question: the Hellenic period and the Hellenistic period. Basically, the Hellenic period is everything before Alexander the Great. So if we're studying Greek history and we're talking about things that happened before Alexander, that's the Hellenic period. After Alexander the Great, we call Greek history the Hellenistic period. So if you look at slide 4, I kind of got a timeline up there. And the dates are rough. Don't think the dates are set in stone. And a lot of these older dates, depending on what textbook you look at, they'll be a little bit different. But Hellenic just refers to Greek geography, culture, politics before Alexander. Hellenistic refers to Greek-like geography, culture, politics after Alexander the Great. We'll kind of talk more about that when we get to Alexander. What did the Greeks contribute to Western civilization? Well, they contributed a lot. Democracy, the writing of history. Herodotus is kind of the first historian. Philosophy, lots of poems and plays, architecture and sculpture. These are all things the Greeks contributed to Western civilization. What are our sources for studying the ancient Greeks? Well, we have physical sources. We have things like clay pots, tablets, buildings, things archaeologists dig up. We've also got writings. The Theogony is the story of the gods. The Iliad and the Odyssey talk about the Trojan War and kind of Odysseus traveling back home. We've got works of philosophy. We've got plays. Linear B, that's the only form of Greek writing we have during the Bronze Age. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Epic poems transmit a lot of stories about the Greeks. We'll talk about that here in a little while. I said we have historians. We have Herodotus. Thucydides is another famous Greek historian. We'll talk about him later. We've got Plato and Aristotle, writings of theirs. Like I said, plays and poetry. Look at slide 10. I just want you to familiarize yourself with Greek geography. And one thing I do want you to know about Greek geography is the geography of the Greek peninsula and the Peloponnesus is very fragmented. There's lots of hills and mountains, and because it's so geographically fragmented, the history of Greece is a history of political fragmentation. Ancient Greece is not a country. They didn't think of themselves as members of a nation, citizens of a nation. They thought of themselves as citizens of a city-state. So you have Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. These are all city-states, and you would have considered yourself an Athenian or a Spartan. That idea is more important than the idea of I'm a Greek. But just kind of look at slide 10, as you kind of read and watch these lectures, it'll kind of help you with your geography help you with your understanding if you know this geography. Um, Hellas is the homeland of the Greeks. The Greeks called themselves Hellenes. They didn't call themselves Greeks. They called their homeland Hellas. The Romans are where we get the term the Greeks from. Um, they had this term, I think it's pronounced Graecae, land of the Greeks. So the Romans are kind of why we call the Greeks the Greeks. The first two civilizations we're going to look at are the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. There's a couple archaeologists in the 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann. He discovered the sites of Troy and Mycenae, and then Sir Arthur Evans discovered the palace at Knossos in the late 19th century. This is where the Minoans were from. So these guys kind of discovered some sites that we're going to look at a little bit, but you don't have to remember them. They're just kind of two guys that kind of kickstarted this new study of Greece. A lot of the interest in Greek history started during the 19th century because of these archaeological finds. So we're going to look at two civilizations. I'm on slide 17. We're going to look at the Minoan civilization. They kind of were focused around the area of Crete. And then we're going to look at the Mycenaean civilization on the mainland. I have a lot of information in here. I probably put too much in since this is just an introductory Western civilization course. I probably shared too much information, but I kind of liked the Greeks and the Romans, so I tended to pack in more information than probably needed to. So I'm going to speed through a lot of this stuff on the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. I'll tell you what you might need to know for a quiz, but you can look through the slide on your own, the whole thing, but I will skip around a little bit. So basically, archaeology and epic poetry are what we have to go off of to kind of reconstruct these two civilizations. Like I said, Sir Arthur Evans kind of named the Minoan civilization. A lot of what he found were huge palaces that had a lot of similarities. You know, he found other places too. These palaces would have a throne room, residential quarters, workshop, storerooms, courtyards, balconies, painted walls, light wells, you know, kind of holes in the walls that let light in, running water. Historians called this type of society palatial society because they have all these palaces throughout Crete that have similar characteristics. If you look at slide 20 and the next few slides, I've got some pictures of the palace at Knossos. You can see it's pretty interesting, the stuff they've dug up. If you look at slide 28, you can kind of look through those pictures, but on slide 28, if you want to see what the palace may have looked like when it was actually functional, I've got a YouTube clip here. You can click on it. It's an animated kind of tour of the palace. It's pretty cool, but it kind of gives you an idea of what the palace would have looked like. Linear A is the writing associated with the Minoans. I think this is a quiz question. We don't know what Linear A says. It still hasn't been deciphered, but historians think that what is on there is probably economic and administrative writing. You know, collecting taxes, writing down how much grain is brought to the palace, stuff like that. The Minoans didn't have a lot of fortifications around their palaces. So a lot of historians are like, maybe they weren't as warlike as other ancient peoples. But there's other views too. If you look at slide 32, you can see how you have water or the sea surrounding Crete. You might not have needed walls around your palaces simply for the fact that you have a whole sea surrounding your island. So how is the enemy going to attack you when they've got to go across the sea? So that might have been part of it too. Slide 33 and 34, I've got some linear A writing. And if you look at slide 35 and 36, you can see how the Minoans on Crete were kind of the crossroads of the Mediterranean. You know, they'll find stuff from Egypt on the island of Crete. They'll find stuff from Syria or Mesopotamia on Crete. And they'll find stuff from the Greek mainland on Crete. It just kind of shows that the whole area, you know, traded, and Crete was kind of at the crossroads. Kind of an interesting fact. Um, I'm skipping through some of these. We don't know a lot about the Minoan religion. We do find places that are sanctuaries found in caves and houses, which will have like religious artifacts. But because we don't know what Linear A says, we don't know what they wrote about their religion or if they even did write down stuff about religion. Uh, there was a there's lots of theories about why the Minoans on Crete kind of went away or why their civilization collapsed. One theory is that there was a volcano that erupted on the island of Thera, maybe around 1630 BC. Um, you know, maybe a tidal wave hit Crete and kind of wrecked Minoan civilization. We're not sure. Those are some theories. So we've kind of had this civilization on the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization. They get eclipsed by the Mycenaean civilization on mainland Greece and kind of the Peloponnesus. Um, and there is this debate, did the Cretans, did the Minoans colonize the Greek mainland, or are the Mycenaeans totally separate and they kind of have their own culture? That's kind of a debate. What historians do know is mainland Greece, the Mycenaeans, they conquered the Minoans around 1400 BC. Um, our sources for Mycenaean civilization, we've got three main sources. This is slide 51. We've got Linear B, which is a form of Greek writing. A guy named Michael Ventris did decipher this, so we do know what Linear B says. So Linear A is not deciphered, and it's associated with the Minoans. Linear B, we do know what it says, and it's associated with the Mycenaeans. So we have Linear B. We have the Homeric poems, the Iliad, the Odyssey. This tells us about the Mycenaeans. And then we have archaeology that tells us about the Mycenaeans as well. The Mycenaeans had this kind of interesting tomb called a Thalos tomb. It's also nicknamed the Beehive tomb. If you look on slide 54, you can kind of see why. It looks like a giant beehive. But these tombs were reserved for, kings or kind of important people. You couldn't build something like this for every person that died. Um, but I got some cool pictures of it you can kind of look at. If you look at slide 58, that's the citadel at Mycenae. You can kind of see how these are huge walls. If you look at slide 59, you can see a picture of a person. So these walls are a lot taller than a person. So the Mycenaeans had walls around their palaces. So a lot of historians think they were more warlike than the Minoans. There's kind of this interesting story in the Iliad. There's this king. His name is King Nestor of Pylos. Um, like I said, a lot of people don't think that the Homeric poems are accurate. A lot of historians thought the Trojan War never happened. But then when you have people like Heinrich Schliemann digging up Troy, in the 1930s, you had a guy named Carl Blegen. He discovered this palace, and it's the palace of Nestor of Pylos. So you have a lot of things from the Iliad and the Odyssey, a lot of palaces being discovered with the names that are from the Iliad and the Odyssey. So maybe there is some truth to some of that. So if you look at slide 64, I've got some basic facts about the Mycenaeans. You can kind of read those. That's kind of a summary. They had palaces as well, with things like plumbing, wall paintings. Usually the Mycenaean palaces aren't as grand as the Minoan palaces. The leaders of the Mycenaeans were these warrior kings. They're the political and military leaders. Okay, so if you look at slide 68, you've got kind of a little timeline, I guess you could call it there. You see that Homer um, flourished somewhere around the 8th century. The Homeric poems are written down somewhere there a little bit afterwards. They tell us about the Mycenaeans of the 12th century. Sometimes historians call the 12th century the 13th century. That's the 1200s. the 13th century BC, the Age of Heroes, because that's when people like Agamemnon, Menelaus, Achilles, Odysseus lived. That's when the Trojan War took place. So a lot of the writings that we have about the Mycenaeans come from Homer. So Homer is the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. You should remember that. The Homeric poems are sort of a sacred text for the Greeks. If you think about it, the Greeks don't have a religious book, so their poems are kind of like their religious books. You would study these poems, you would know all the great heroes, you would know all the deeds, you would know all their character flaws. So basically, if you wanted to live your life, be the best Greek you could be, you would probably know these Homeric poems and kind of know what the good examples were to follow. Poems at the time would have like formulas of fixed lines, phrases. You would have a set story memorized, but you would travel around and maybe you would tweak the story a little bit. So these stories vary over time and region. Eventually, they get written down and they're attributed to Homer. The Iliad tells the story of Helen of Troy. Uh, she gets kidnapped by Paris. Helen is the wife of Menelaus. So basically, King Agamemnon and King Menelaus, they're Greeks. They go off to fight the Trojans to get Paris back. What can the Homeric poems tell us? Well, they tell us what the virtues of the Greeks were. So, bravery, self-control, wisdom, loyalty to your friends, hatred of your enemies. Anything that makes you a good hero or a good fighter, that's a virtue you should have. Um, so that's something important. During kind of this Mycenaean period, uh, the basic unit was the demos. This is the geographical unit of people in the surrounding territory. The leaders back then were called basileus. That just means king or chief. They're not an absolute king. They can't do whatever they want, but they are kind of the political and military leaders. Um, if you've ever seen or if you've ever read the Iliad, there'll be a lot of scenes where like the king wants to do something, so he'll gather like a council of his warriors or his best men, and he'll kind of have to convince them what to do. He can't just say, "I order you to do this and you have to do it, otherwise I'll put you to death." So the basileus kind of has to lead by example, I guess you could say. He has to get people to go along with him. He can't just run roughshod over them. There's this line in the Iliad. Peleus is talking to his son Achilles, and he says, "Be both a speaker of words and a doer of deeds." So that might be kind of a good value or a good characteristic to have during the Age of Heroes. There's this other value called xenia. It just means guest friendship. It's showing hospitality or protection to somebody from another country. There's this famous scene in the Iliad where Diomedes and Glaucus are fighting, and I forget which one is the Trojan and which one is the Greek, but they're basically on the battlefield and they're fighting. Everyone's killing each other, and they're about to fight. And one of them says, like, "Hey, my grandfather came to your grandfather, and he showed him Xenia. So let's not fight each other. Let's go kill some other guys. We won't fight each other because our grandparents practice this value." Um, the oikos is the fundamental unit of society in the Greek Dark Ages. So you've got the family, the house, the property. So like, if you're a man, you would have your wife and your children and your slaves and your extended family. That's your family. That's your household. And then all the property you have on top of that. Um, that's basically the fundamental unit of society. If you look at slide 88, what destroyed the world of the Minoans, the Mycenaeans? There's lots of different theories. There's the Thera eruption. Um, there's the idea that the Minoans became weak and the Mycenaeans invaded and took over. There's this theory of a Doric invasion. Um, these people from the north invaded the Greek mainland. There's an idea of a systems collapse. Maybe the Greeks, because they fought this long Trojan War, they eventually collapsed on their own. You can't fight a war forever. Your society will not it'll go through hard times because of that. There's the invasions of the Sea Peoples. Maybe that threw off the Greeks. Um, so there's lots of different theories. You don't have to know all these. I just kind of included them. Okay, so basically, if you look at slide 91, you've got the Minoan civilization, the Mycenaean civilization, and then from the year 1200 to 1100 BC, you have a lot of destruction of the Mycenaean sites, and this ushers in the Greek Dark Ages. So that's the next lecture we'll look at. The Greeks have their own Dark Age.